Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood research director here at California YIMBY, where we're working hard to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Bill Fulton. If you've been paying any attention to California planning over the last 30 years, Bill likely needs no introduction. But among his many current roles, he's a senior advisor at PFM Management and Budget Consulting Group and a fellow at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. We love those guys. He's also the author of the literal textbook on California planning, No Points for Subtlety, the guide to California planning. I know, like many people, I keep it here handy by my desk and consult it regularly. And he also just released a new collection of essays, Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate. I thoroughly enjoyed it, published by our friends at Island Press. In this interview, we talk about how California planning has changed, the future of cities like Los Angeles and Houston, and why place continues to matter in an age of Zoom. While I have you here, if you're enjoying Abundance, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us to expand our audience and let more people hear the good news about what we're up to. If you're not enjoying Abundance, go ahead and leave us a review anyway, because feedback is very much welcome, and we're forever trying to improve. With that, thanks for listening, and on to the show. So, of course, you're well known for California, Los Angeles. The most natural place to start is Auburn, New York, the city that made you famous, of course. It figures heavily in your most recent book, and I'm wondering, other than just reflecting on the place where you're from influencing you, I think you draw a lot of lessons from Auburn that are, living in a place like LA where the complaint is always like, how do we deal with overwhelming growth and overwhelming demand? It's refreshing to start a book in a place where it's like that can't be taken for granted necessarily, and it's kind of been a rough half century for a city like Auburn.
It has been. Auburn is a legacy. It's a 30,000 people or so. It's a legacy factory town in upstate New York. It's in the Finger Lakes. It's kind of near. It's 40 miles from Ithaca, so it's kind of near Cornell. And I think one of the things I always have brought to the discussion in California is an understanding that a lot of people in California don't have, that you can't necessarily take growth for granted, right? It could run out. The tables should turn. One of the things I've been thinking lately is there's an essay I want to write called "Is California the New New York?" By which I mean to say, after 170 years, does California have to figure out what New York had to figure out in the 70s and 80s, which is what happens if you don't take population growth? If you don't have no more population growth, how do you still prosper? And the interesting thing, I started thinking about and writing. I wrote the main essay in the book about Auburn and how it shaped me as an urbanist early in the pandemic, when all of a sudden we all had a lot more time to reflect and life was not as frantic. I wasn't flying all over the place. I wasn't even commuting to work. I had more time. And so I started to reflect on that, and I wrote this essay, the main essay in the book, Place and Prosperity. And it really, for the first time in my life, it really made me think about consciously what the qualities of place were in this town. Mm-hmm. And how that really did shape me. And the main thing that shaped me was when I was a teenager and in college, half the town got torn down by urban renewal. And there used to be a joke in Auburn that Auburn was too well connected at HUD during this period. If only Auburn had, which it was. There was a former city manager who worked at HUD. The mayor at that time was very prominent. He was the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And if only Auburn had not been so prominent, it might have gotten overlooked by the federal government, and a lot of the place aspects could have been preserved. The challenge in a place like Auburn is not just how to manage decline and how to crawl back from a very traumatic experience of urban renewal. I always say I had urban renewal PTSD, and that's why I became an urban planner. But also, to go to the themes of the book, how to make sure that you can value and I'll say exploit or take advantage of those assets that you still have after 200 years of being around. And to me, one of those is that, with the exception of the part of town that got torn down by urban renewal, Auburn still has strong, like many older small towns in the Northeast and Midwest, small cities, Auburn still has very strong place amenities. I like to say that the most prosperous block in town now is the one that didn't get torn down by urban renewal. That's now Restaurant Row. The other thing, perhaps less relevant to our conversation, but still interesting, is that the other thing that happened when I was a teenager was all the factories closed. There were 40 large factories, and almost all of them closed. But manufacturing has, with reshoring and so forth, manufacturing has come back. And Brookings recently did ran a little report for me, which said that the manufacturing output of Cayuga County, which is the county that Auburn is in, has doubled, gone up 100% since 2010. So in addition to the place amenities, there's the people, and what I've always said about Auburn is that people in Auburn just like to make stuff, and they're good at it, and they've been doing it for 200 years, and they want to keep doing it. So what I think I learned in writing that essay was that both place assets and economic assets can be very enduring and can help even a struggling town bounce back sooner or later. The other thing that made me realize is that virtually every successful city goes through transitions. It reshapes itself from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. Cities don't, in spite of what we have always tried to do in California by controlling growth, you can't freeze dry a town. And cities change. They change not only physically, but they change economically and demographically. So you think of Boston, how did this seafaring town become the world's capital of higher education? You look at Silicon Valley and you realize 50 years ago, Silicon Valley was a manufacturing center. It was the tech manufacturing center of the world. And yet, even though the manufacturing moved, Silicon Valley really did reinvent itself in the same industry, but positioned itself differently to become different. LA.
I mean, just a quick point on the Auburn piece, right? I've been in the Midwest, and I would consider parts of upstate New York to be the greater Midwest, right?
Yes. Central and Western New York are really part of the Rust Belt. Yes.
Yeah, and there is this real stickiness of place. You can tell. I mean, I was in Detroit recently, right? And of course, Detroit has had probably the toughest century of any major American city. But in the metro area, there's still just tons of engineering talent, right? A lot of it's just suburbanized. There's still this unbelievable expertise in this place that it left the city proper, but there's still this broader ecosystem of engineering expertise that hasn't gone away. And if it hasn't gone away under the conditions of the last 50 years, especially, it's probably never going to go away, right?
No, it is. That's a very good point. Auto engineering expertise will remain in Houston. I mean, in Detroit, no matter what. In Houston, where I've lived for the last few years, I see something similar, right? Houston, this may not be literally true, but it sure seems like it, that Houston has more engineers per capita than any other city I've ever seen. And all kinds of different engineers, obviously petroleum engineers, but chemical engineers, civil engineers. Houston has an enormous infrastructure capacity, talent here. And that it's a good point that at Detroit, it's a good point that the engineering talent has outlasted the original structure of the auto industry. In Houston, which is currently in the throes of figuring out, do we want to be the oil and gas capital of the world, or do we want to be the energy capital of the world? And if we want to be the energy capital of the world, how do we beat Silicon Valley to do that with alternative energy? Houston will, no matter what happens to oil and gas in the next 20 to 40 years, will continue to be one of the world's great engineering cities. So I think you're right that, and that's one of the lessons I take from Auburn, that people like to make stuff, is that human assets don't always go away as long as there's a substantial industry still there, even if it isn't as big or robust as it used to be, it's still there. And that talent is still there. And you don't have to go, used to be, if you were an auto engineer, you had to go to Detroit. Just like used to be, if you were a petroleum engineer, you had to come to Houston. That's not going to be true in the future, but the richness of such talent in a location is, as you say, sticky, and will continue to attract both new talent and encourage locals to go into that business. Just like people in LA tend to go into the film industry, people in the Bay Area tend to go into tech, right?
Well, and I mean, two quick thoughts on this. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, and my dad was an auto engineer at Toyota. And part of why Toyota was there is that Lexington is just down,
Lexington,
so many hours from Detroit, right?
Yeah, I remember touring the Georgetown plant a number of years ago, which the Toyota plant right outside of Lexington, and it had never occurred to me before that Lexington really was part of the I-75 auto corridor, and Lexington was basically the closest place you could get to Detroit on I-75 and be in a right to work state.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Toyota put the plant there. And so that I-75 corridor has continued into the south, and it made total sense. Now we'll see with the auto assembly plants how sticky that is. Another story that I didn't tell in the book, but I often tell in speeches, has to do with a project I researched many years ago. Was the first foreign auto assembly plant in the U.S., which was a Volkswagen plant near Pittsburgh. It was heavily subsidized at the time. The governor got a lot of crap for putting so much money into it. And there was UAW had no presence. There was no history of auto assembly in Pittsburgh, surprisingly. And for better or worse, what they were making was VW Rabbits, which went out of vogue quickly. And so the plant closed after 10 years. But they had a really nice plant, and they had trained a workforce that knew how to assemble things. And so Motorola moved in. They got another 10 or 15 or 20 years out of that plant because Motorola moved in and the same workforce just started assembling televisions. I think you're right that human assets and the workforce, not just place assets, but the workforce, what people are good at, what they're interested in, those are very important assets in shaping particularly the economy of a place. I've been amazed in Auburn in the last few years how many local people, entrepreneurs, have started up what are now successful manufacturing or sort of repair companies, and they're reasonably well capitalized. There's a pretty strong local banking, community banking industry in Central New York, more than I would have thought. And so the resilience of some of these Rust Belt places that are coming back in a different way, not with thousands of factory assembly line jobs, but are coming back in a certain way is really striking. And I think there are lessons for other parts of the country, including California.
Yeah. Well, you speculate that Toyota went to Georgetown because it's close to I-75, but the urban legend is that the Japanese executives loved being near bourbon and horse racing. So, I mean, and there's something too. I mean, at that, like the Kentucky bourbon industry was basically bailed out by Japanese consumers in the 80s, right? But yeah. No, I think you're right. And a lot of people, and this gets to the whole thing, like we think of Detroit and we imagine factories closing, but there's still thousands of suppliers and small shops that they didn't stop, and Toyota is having to buy.
And so the supplies just flowed down I-75 instead of up.
Right.
From Indiana and Ohio.
Well, and there's an essay in the book that you make. You cover this with respect to LA, right? Because I think there's this. I don't know. To my mind, it seems like this perennial anxiety of what if LA were to lose Hollywood, right? And you're sort of skeptical of this. You're like, no, this is for reasons I think we've been discussing, like entertainment is kind of baked into this place. Like if you want to be top of your game in movies and TV, right? People have been predicting the death of Hollywood in LA since almost it began, right? And it just hasn't happened.
Yes. And I can recall in my career researching and reporting on when Orlando was supposed to displace LA. I mean, Orlando was supposed to displace LA, Atlanta was supposed to, Toronto was supposed to, Vancouver was supposed to. And I used to have a joke that in the end, the only thing that would happen that would be left in LA would be, studio executives and producers having lunch at the Ivy. But it is still the center of entertainment. And another thing to bear in mind is that it is the center not just of the talent, of the creative talent, it is the center of craft as well. That there's an enormous craft workforce in Los Angeles that supports the entertainment industry that is fairly portable, right? And they go other places to do shooting. Coincidentally, one of my high school friends from Auburn, also trained as a planner, he just retired as one of the leading location managers in Hollywood. He lives in Mar Vista.
I think that's the most glamorous job you can have as a planner, right? Location scout for film.
Yeah. What happened was he got a job. He got his degree as environmental planner. He wound up working for the Forest Service. He wound up assigned to movies from the Forest Service side in Montana, and then he flipped over and he just the latest Top Gun movie was that was his second to last movie. There's a Scorsese movie coming out that was his last movie, but he lives in Mar Vista, which is in West LA. And for the last 10 years, he's probably spent 10 months a year in Georgia, just because so much shooting has moved to Georgia. And but it's really interesting how location shooting turns out not to be the only important thing in entertainment. And it may be less important with CGI, right? But what Georgia has done at great taxpayer expense is use location shooting as the leading edge to try to generate an entire economy that includes the craft workers and so forth. But LA just that industry is so huge in LA. One of the stories, I think I tell this story somewhere I do tell this story in the book. My former in-laws owned a prop rental house on Gower Street in Hollywood, around the corner from Paramount, which was there for decades, specialized in antiques. And it made me realize, I mean, LA doesn't just have the studios and the talent and all the craftspeople. This is less important with CGI now, but in those days, LA also had all the stuff, right? There was just an enormous amount of stuff that you needed to shoot a movie and shoot television shows that was available at places like my in-laws' prop rental house. And if you're filming, let's say you're doing a
that's depicted in the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The big warehouse where they
right. But what would happen is that one of the studios or one of the production companies would greenlight a pilot for a TV show. The set decorator would come over to the prop rental store and just point and say, yeah, this, and this. And by the way, we have no idea when we're ever going to give it back to you. You might get it back next week. You might not get it back for 10 years. We don't know. And that lamp might have been in Mississippi last week for a movie shooting. So that really taught me the lesson that economic infrastructure consists of all kinds of things that you might not expect, right? And in LA, at least before CGI, all the prop stuff, which was in warehouses in Hollywood and Burbank, was a tremendous economic asset and a tremendous and very sticky, as you say, a tremendous break on things leaving LA. In fact, in the era when my in-laws owned the prop rental place, the set decorator would come literally with a tractor trailer to Gower Street, load it all up, and take all that stuff to Mississippi or Georgia or Maine or Vancouver or wherever the shooting was going. And then when the shooting was over, bring it back. And then the next week, some TV show would get it.
Well, there are a lot of little eureka moments that I had when reading the book, but the one that, I mean, this argument that you're making in this essay in Place and Prosperity, where you're like, this, yes, like certain elements of filmmaking are leaving LA, but it's kind of the low value add. Like we go out to the site, maybe a local caterer gets a job, maybe a local security service gets a job, but we bring out all the cinematographers and the film people and the actors,
Right.
and then we go back to LA. And the connection between that and manufacturing, right? I think, of course, there
It's very,
people get so
yes,
anxious, like, wow, the Happy Meal toys are made in China. That's so upsetting. And it's like, yeah, but like the
that's the
concept
lowest.
development and then the marketing
Yep.
is what's valuable, right? Like making
That's
the
the
widget.
lowest, right? What is called in Hollywood terms the pre and post production are far more
Yeah,
valuable than the actual shooting.
right.
And you know, I question whether recruiting the shooting. I just worked on a economic development critique of the state of New Mexico, and New Mexico, like Georgia, has gone whole hog into location shooting credits, production credits. That's why the Alec Baldwin movie was being filmed in New Mexico, the one that was so controversial, and I did not quantitatively figure this out, but I'm pretty sure that the state of New Mexico, they get some pretty good, at least temporary jobs, and they do get something of a permanent workforce. But the state government itself does not get its investment back in terms of revenue,
Mm-hmm.
and because that is relatively low value. But it's really interesting to think of manufacturing in terms of pre and post production as well. That's where most of the value is added. You want to you want to make the stuff in China, go ahead, but that's not where most of the economic value is added.
Well, and then out of post-production film work, right? LA becomes the center of the video game industry today, right? I
Yes,
mean,
right,
that's,
right.
you know, the same people who are doing graphics works for films, that skill set translates very naturally over to what's now the largest entertainment industry in the world, right? And I
Yes.
mean, this is I think something that you have a lot of really thoughtful meditations on in the book. It's just the nature of economic development, right? And there's a certain sense in which um these, you know, I think it's a very Jane Jacobs kind of point, right? Like these
Mm.
things just kind of like unfold. You can't really predict like what the main industry in a place like LA could be in 50 years. I mean, I suspect it will be some outgrowth of entertainment, some outgrowth of industries, you know. I mean, even aviation, right? In a certain sense,
Yes.
aviation is dead in LA. In another sense, like, you know, LA remains this huge R&D hub, right? But you can't,
Right.
you know, I think you can do small things to facilitate that, but you can't necessarily micromanage it in the way. I mean, right? So like New Mexico is undertaking this project
It's
of,
gonna, yeah,
well,
it's
New Mexico
gonna
is trying to,
evolve. Hmm.
yeah, they're trying to subsidize their way to these projects, but you know, I mean, just merely giving money for film shoots, right? That's not how you get a film industry.
Well, I think the lesson from Georgia is that if you do enough of that, you do get something of a film industry. But it
Yeah.
costs Georgia, it costs the Georgia state government over $1 billion a year in tax credits to attract enough shooting to build an underlying industry. That's an enormous investment. If you were the governor of Georgia walking in today, would you say, okay, if I could do anything with $1 billion for economic development, would I do that?
Mm.
I think the answer to that's probably no. But because film is glamorous, and because people are always interested in where films are shot, then that and places where films are shot become tourist, or even referred to become tourist destinations, right? Like I say in the book, if you think back to the television show Cheers, a bar that never existed in Boston, but only was invented by screenwriters in Los Angeles, is now a big tourist attraction in Boston.
Right.
Right.
Or but yeah, Twin Peaks, right? The David Lynch show. I think the
Right.
fans just picked some town in like Eastern Washington, and they were like, "Yeah, enough of the shooting happened here. We're going to imagine that this is Twin Peaks, right?"
Well, I'll give you another example near my hometown of Auburn. If you watch It's a Wonderful Life, every Christmas, everyone watches It's a Wonderful Life. All of the geographical references of It's a Wonderful Life are from upstate New York. And so, like the bank regulator says, I'm going to have Christmas with my sister in Elmira, and Jimmy Stewart's brother gets a job at a factory in Buffalo. And so the neighboring city, and remember the town in It's a Wonderful Life is called Bedford Falls. The neighboring city to Auburn is called Seneca Falls. So they simply decided that they were the place that Frank Capra was thinking about, even though there was no evidence that he'd ever actually been there. And so now you go to Seneca Falls and there's an It's a Wonderful Life museum with all kinds of It's a Wonderful Life memorabilia that they probably got from the prop rental houses in Hollywood, if you think about it. But that's a total invention of a tourist attraction based on appropriation of a fictional place.
Well, but I think you say
Same
this.
thing.
I think you say this with respect to LA, and I felt this. I mean, I grew up, of course, in Kentucky, but when you come to LA, you start to you feel like you recognize a look, because I mean, so much of the entertainment you've consumed, even if it's like theoretically set. I so often I will be, just doing something in LA, and I'll discover, oh, like on that block is the house that was supposed to be the house from this horror movie that was set in like Illinois.
Right.
Or I can't even now. Whenever I watch TV, I just notice every single commercial was clearly filmed in Metro LA. And so there's this sense of familiarity you have with, I think all Americans have with LA, just because of so much shooting had happened here and still happens here. And there's a sense of like, it's almost like this kind of default place in the collective imagination. Like it's the
Yes, that's right. It's sort of the default suburb, especially. And when I moved to LA in my 20s, I was stunned by the amount of LA I absorbed just watching television as a kid in this small factory town in upstate New York. And then as I'm sure you just described it, once you are very familiar with LA's geography and built environment, watching TV becomes very distracting, right? Because you're inclined to not even follow what's going on. You're just looking at, oh, I know that place. I drove down that street last week. That house is where my friend used to live. I used to work in that office building.
I mean, the show for me that it's sort of ruined is The Office. Now, whenever they drive around in the off, the sitcom, one, you can regularly see palm trees when they're like in the outside space, the
and
warehouse.
They're supposed to be and they're in Scranton or somewhere like that.
Scranton. And then they drive around and all the grass is dead. And you're like, that is not what Scranton looks like. But before I moved out here, I hadn't even noticed it. I was like, yeah, sure. I'm sure Scranton looks like that. It didn't even register, right? But then you move out here and you're like, oh no, all the vegetation is Southern California.
Yep, right.
I want to pivot to LA a little bit. I mean, of course, you wrote, The Reluctant Metropolis, one of my favorite books about LA, and definitely helped me to understand my newly adopted home. I'll just say at the outset, I feel like LA is in a really tough place right now. I feel like LA is in. I mean, I'm sure there have been waves of this, but I get the sense that there's this malaise over LA, and I don't know if it's the recent situation with the council, with the remarks, or just the mounting homelessness and housing crisis, or the population loss. I feel like there's a malaise over. I don't know how to describe it, and I'm just kind of curious if you have thoughts on LA in this current moment.
Yeah, I do think LA does go through periodic dystopian periods, and I think that is happening now, and because it's happening now, and you and I have talked about this separately, it does make me kind of sad that Mike Davis isn't around to explain to us just how awful and dystopian the current situation is, because City of Quartz was a pretty accurate reflection of a previous dystopian period in LA. I think it's just a couple of things about it. One is, the middle class economy never recovered in LA from the decline of the aerospace industry around the time that City of Quartz was published. And so it has become, as many cities have, much more of a rich and poor city. And sort of in contrast to the Bay Area, which has ridden tech much better. And in fact, Michael Storper wrote a very good book comparing, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, comparing the experiences of the two metro areas over the last 30 years. So I think the lack of a middle class economy for 30 years has really taken its toll on LA. And now we're in a situation where you have this enormous, I'll call it working poor, low wage economy, and extremely high home prices, which now can that go on for every time Rick Cole, my friend Rick Cole often quotes the old economist Herb Stein as saying most things that can't go on forever don't. But so you would think this can't go on forever, and you do see an exodus of relatively low wage workers from LA. And I think what we're seeing in California right now is there's population loss, but there's also replacement. The people coming in are far more affluent than the people who are leaving. But I think it's this mismatch really between the jobs, the workforce, and the housing market is really a severe problem and is taking its toll on the city. And I also think, I moved to LA over 40 years ago, and at that time it was just on the tail end of the post-war boom, and there was still a tremendous sense of optimism. Like LA is a new place. It's not like the older cities. It's different. The government is cleaner. And I think what I've seen in the last 40 years I've seen LA become much more like a New York or a Chicago, where there's this just incredible thicket of vested interests and potentially corrupting influences in politics, in the interplay between politics and government and real estate development, which you see in those other cities. It took a long time for that to develop in LA, but I think it's finally here. And the whole Jose Huizar story is a good example of that.
Well, and riffing on that point, I think somewhat ironically, because I think we associate real estate related graft with kind of classic urban growth machine sort of politics. But I think my read on LA is like we're very much in a kind of a home voter dynamic, right? Almost every project's discretionary, very little is allowed as of right, so everything goes through city council. And so it's like a it's real estate and entitlement related corruption. But because we had these massive downzonings that just made it impossible to actually build anything as of right, there was there's a friend on Twitter was tweeting out the changing geography of multifamily permitting in LA. And so you see the color of the dot. I'll share this in the show notes. The color of the dot is the decade that it was built, and then the size of the dot is based on the size of the project. And it's from the 60s through the 2010s. It's fascinating because the 60s is all lots of very small projects, like dingbats being built kind of all over West LA and anywhere that there's like high housing prices. And then by the 2010s, it's a few very large bubbles, like a few very large projects that are being built by, large developers with deep pockets and lobbyists and the resources to engage in sophisticated corruption. Right. And I guess that's how I would describe like passing a duffel bag full of cash under a bathroom stall. But right. Like it's a very different, like, development environment, right? Like we've kind of chased out the small builder who never would have been able to lobby for a permit, and we've left this space where everything that gets built is intensely political, and it's going to be large and it's going to be controversial.
Well, I think yes, it makes me that stimulates a lot of thoughts. One is, and Huizar is only the most recent example, that the chair of the Plum Committee on the City Council, the Planning and Land Use Committee, is one of the most powerful people in the city, more powerful than the mayor in many ways. And I've seen several Plum Committee chairs.
And that's the planning and land use
management or something like that. Planning, land use, something.
Essentially, any rezoning has to go through that committee for those who.
Right. Yeah. And so you saw Huizar succumb to the temptation of corruption. But even before that, I can remember when Ed Reyes was the chair of the Plum Committee. Ed was my classmate at UCLA Planning School, and he wasn't corrupt, but he was very aware of the power he had and the power that he wielded. Now, later in my career, as you know, I was the planning director of San Diego, and there are 9 council members in San Diego. And I can remember some developer from LA coming down and wanting to get a project through and saying, so when do we go see the council office? And I said, well, never. And he just couldn't believe it, right? It just was not in his universe, that it was not in his world that this was even possible. That's how political it is in LA.
I mean, in New York, in New York, that's the first question. When I was at the Department of City Plan, that's the first question you ask an applicant. Have you talked to the council's office yet?
Right. And that's the first question you ask in LA too. The other thing I would say about the small builders is that land in LA has just become so incredibly expensive that it's almost impossible to build a small project anymore. Anyway, the Terner Center recently at Berkeley, which I'm affiliated with, recently came out with a report on how little SB9 is being used around the state. That's the law that allows lot splits and duplexes and stuff. And I had a lot of hope for sort of duplex, triplex, fourplex for a long time. But one of the things I've realized is, in a place like LA today, you just can't make that pencil unless you've got unless you're going to build a fourplex and sell each unit for $2 million. And who would buy a $2 million unit in a fourplex, right? So I think it's a combination of things. The small developers got driven out by the process, and now the land prices have gotten so high that there's no way those small builders could come back in and make a small project go. These projects have to be big in order to go.
I mean, that's partly what I see as like maybe the longer term value of ADU legalization, though. I mean, so like, I'm sure you've seen these signs. I live in a dingbat. I live on a street of dingbats. And this will probably be the fourth time that I've tried to define it on the podcast. So you're just going to have to go look it up if you don't know what a dingbat is. And on every single building, there's a sign that says earthquake retrofits, right? That's like fixing up the dingbats to make sure they don't collapse when the big one hits. And then ADUs, right? And it's this like class of small developers who has found these two things. These are people who in past generations might have been building duplexes and fourplexes in LA. But today we have them kind of doing these earthquake retrofits of buildings that for the most part probably should have been redeveloped. But then we give them a new product, which is, here's a small little backyard home. Land prices aren't a factor because you're working for a homeowner or a developer who has already acquired the property. And then the entitlements are just a breeze. I mean, in San Jose, they have like same day permitting for ADUs. To my mind, I see like a kernel of hope there, where it's like there are these small little general contractors who are maybe getting back into the habit of building homes with ADUs. And if we can just iron out some of the details with SB9 projects, they could have another asset. The thing I hear, though, well, just close out that point very quickly. The concern I hear is if it was owner occupancy, those would be much easier to build and sell. But there are other barriers that stand in the way of condoizing these projects, which maybe we can get into.
I also think there's a physical thing. First of all, I'm astonished how quickly the ADU industry has matured and sort of standardized in California. Go on our website and pick out your model, and we'll come and drop it in your backyard. Right? That it is amazing.
Will fly in. Right?
or maybe it'll be delivered by an Amazon drone and just dropped in your backyard, right? But I'm amazed at how quickly that industry has matured. So there's clearly a market for that kind of unit, and clearly appetite on the part of landowners to do it. If you own a single family home, why would you tear it down and build a duplex when you can just drop an ADU in the backyard? That's so much easier.
Well, I think that's been that path is just so much easier. If you want to have two units on a lot, just build an ADU. The duplex process isn't there, right?
Right. That's right. So I don't see any reason why. And so what you see in San Diego with what I call the endless ADU ordinance, which you may be familiar with,
yes,
you can build as many ADUs as you want, as long as you build half of them affordable, and you build the affordable first, all the way up to where you hit the building envelope. So you could build 10 ADUs in a backyard. Well, that's small developers there, and the small developers in San Diego are very clever. What small developers there are doing are they're essentially building little apartment buildings through this ordinance. And so that's why I think the ADU stuff is going to eat the SB9 alive in the end. They're going to wind up not being different things in the end.
When California achieves housing abundance, it'll be by stacking like ADUs on top of each other into like 20-story buildings. We'll still call them ADUs, but they'll be like a bunch of prefab ADUs glued together into effectively a high rise, right?
Well, although you don't see the high rise part of it because of the building envelope restrictions, that is what you're seeing in the city of San Diego now. You see a bunch of ADUs basically stacked on top and around each other in a backyard.
Yeah. I mean, so you've been following California planning for a while. I mean, I think, something I try to be very cognizant of is, of course, I work for California YIMBY, sort of emerging in the mid 2010s, taking the housing affordability crisis in California very seriously. I think the movement's racked up some valuable wins, and I think changed some of the housing discourse in California for the better. But I mean, of course, you write the most popular newsletter on the topic, and I mean, I'm sure you've seen just so many generations of attempts at fixing this, right? I mean, the regional housing needs assessment, right? I mean, that was put in place,
in 1969.
Right. I mean, so, over 50 years ago, right? There's been, or when I was doing research for my book, the literature that really freaked me out would be like the stuff in the late 60s where people were like, hey, these exclusionary zoning requirements are going to raise housing costs and segregate cities. And here I am.
Which they did.
Well, but here I am in the late 20 teens writing this book thinking like, oh, we've learned some stuff about the system. And then I see like somebody in 1968 was like essentially wrote like the thesis of the book. And I'm like, oh, it makes me anxious, and it makes me think, what has like gone wrong and what has gone right over time? Have we learned any lessons? Are we any closer to an affordable California?
Well, obviously, we're further away from an affordable California than we have ever been before. And I think one of the struggles is that an affordable California looks very different than the California we have seen, say, since World War II, or since the 20s, 100 years ago. Because affordable California before was single-family subdivisions built on cheap land, right? And we don't have that anymore, except in certain parts of the valley, the Central Valley. So I think the scary part is that, and what is scary to a lot of people is that the future looks so different than the past. But and people kind of approach this as if this has never been a problem anywhere before in the world, right? And we built this utopian suburban society in California, and it's so precious, and now it's going to get destroyed. And yet you have seen this throughout. One of the things that really struck me a while ago when I was reading Lewis Mumford was, Mumford grew up in New York. He was born in 1895 or something, and he had an uncle or something like that who walked everywhere, just loved to walk all over the city. And so when he was a kid, he walked all over with him everywhere, and he got to know Queens really well when Queens was undeveloped. And so a lot of Lewis Mumford's philosophy was based on his horror at the idea that Queens was being developed and being developed for multifamily. I mean, his glomming onto the Garden City stuff was in large part due to his, I'll call it almost NIMBY reaction to the development of Queens into something that he didn't recognize from when he was a kid. And so I think part of the fear is how can we have a successful California if it is so different from the successful California of the past? Now, I never know whether the NIMBY movement is going to die out when folks like me die, older white folks who are homeowners die, or whether every time anybody who ever gets a lot of home equity in a single family neighborhood will become a NIMBY in the future. I never know the answer to that. But I think one of the things that we have not done a good job of selling people on is people like you will have a different lifestyle in the future in California than you did. When I first ran for office in Ventura, and this is almost 20 years ago now, um, I had I was running for city council. The Teachers Association couldn't endorse in the city council race, but a lot of the teachers who were active did endorse me, and I did a lot of coffees and home fundraising events at the homes of teachers in California who lived in Ventura, who lived in very nice single family homes. And the first thing I would say to them is, you're 60 years old, you're about to retire. Could the person who take your job buy your house? And of course, they knew the answer was no, right? They knew the answer was no. And so I said, well, then maybe your successor will thrive and prosper living in a different type of housing situation, maybe a townhome, maybe a condo. And then I would hasten to add, in those days, because I was on the campaign trail, of course, in a different part of town far away from you, right? But I found that resonated, and I was frustrated during my entire time in office with my inability to penetrate. A lot of it is one of the common things is where are your kids going to live, and the answer with my constituents in Ventura was usually, well, I have two kids. One of them already bought their house in Bakersfield, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Riverside, and the other one will just live in my house. And that creates and I see this in the coastal areas, that creates a kind of a landed gentry, right? Which Prop 13 doesn't help avoid. So but I do think that communicating to people that even some of the folks who are opposed to new housing and different kinds of housing, even when you say this would benefit your kids, they don't always respond. But if you can put them in the place of the 30-year-old person who can't buy a house, then sometimes you get some traction. But I think that there's just enormous fear on lots of people's parts that a successful and affordable California of the future will look so different than a successful in California and affordable California of the past that it's hard for people to imagine. And that's why I mentioned the thing about Mumford, because in the early to mid 20th century, New York went through this exact transition, right? Where enormous amounts of housing was built in the outer boroughs and later in the suburbs. And that housing was mostly rental. It was pretty dense. And it was not like anything anybody outside of Manhattan had ever seen before. And it was pretty scary. But because the political and entitlement system was what it was at the time, and because the developers, including Fred Trump, frankly, were very good at working the political system, all that stuff got built to the benefit for many decades of middle-class families in New York.
Well, Connor Dowdery, who wrote the book Golden Gates, he had a good line on this, right? That it's very easy to build new housing in places where nobody exists, right? So, I mean, right. And of course, like the obvious example of this is it's very easy to build sprawl. I mean, it always cracks me up when people are like, oh, LA would, California would be affordable if they would get rid of their urban growth boundaries. And I'm like, I can take you out to the Mojave or the edge of Riverside County and you will see new subdivisions being built. Like, we still build that. It's just 2 or 3 hours outside of any job center. And there's actually just not demand. There's diminishing value out there, or within cities, commercial and industrial areas. So a lot of cities have been able to get through upzonings that rezone commercial corridors to allow mixed use mid-rise, or rezoning industrial areas, right? But the puzzle that I don't think anyone's really figured out is how you make people comfortable with change happening in places where people currently live, right? And I mean, I think of course, the workaround usually ends up being, well, just don't ask, right? Just change the zoning, have everything be as of right. I mean, this is like Houston. I mean, I want to talk about Houston more in a minute, but right, like Houston just did townhouse legalization in the late 90s, and a lot of residential communities dramatically changed. And I wager that if you had asked the average person, you know, hey, do you want your neighborhood to look like this in 20 years? They probably would have said no.
They would have said no.
But you didn't have institutions that asked them, so the city was able to change and adapt, and that's probably better for the average middle class Houstonian. But to me, like, the ideal way is to solve that problem is how do you make people more comfortable with change? I mean, do we need to just change the way that change the way that change happens in jurisdictions to where it benefits people, or what?
I think I think we're bad for the reasons I described before. I think we're bad at change messaging, right? One of the things I would say to people is your neighborhood is changing all the time. The grass grows, the trees get cut down, your kids grow up, you have teenagers, and all of a sudden you have 4 cars instead of 2. Why is it that there's this particular and as the value of your house goes way up, the demographics of your neighborhood change a lot, right? So that people like you can't move into your neighborhood anymore. Yeah. And so one of the things I always try to say, is why is it that particular kind of change to the physical, to the built environment, why is that particular type of change so scary to you when you seem to accept every other kind of change that comes along, right? And I think a lot of it is that people just deny that the other kind of change is occurring. So I can remember many years ago when I was a planning consultant, I was working on the general plan for Sierra Madre. And most of the people who were involved in the general plan update process were older, white, middle-class homeowners. And their sincere belief was that by opposing additional housing and opposing changes to density, they were protecting the character of their city for people like them. And it was hard for them to see that partly because of the way they were protecting the character of their city, it was no longer affordable to people like them. So I think we're
the buildings stay the same, but the community in every meaningful sense is dramatically different.
Right. Yes, right. And it's really hard to resist change at that level. As you may know, one of the things that has happened in Palo Alto as the community has resisted any kind of change in residential areas is homeowners, because they can't expand their houses, they're building huge basements and much more living space underground, right? So there's something about the physical appearance of the built environment that strikes people emotionally in a way that no other change does. Which and as I say, and I think that is one of the things you have to get underneath. Why is that the thing that bothers you so much? Is it just because that's what you see? Why is that the thing you fear so much? And why are you willing to deny everything else in order to try to believe that protecting your community, you're not protecting your community from change, you're just causing it to change in a different way. And I think that one of the things we're bad, when I say we're bad at change messaging, one of the things I think we're bad at is explaining the choice that people face, right? The question is not, do you want to change or not? The question is how. And people, even when you present that choice to people, and I say this having been in elected office, they still want to deny it. They still want to deny that change is going to happen. But I think you have to frame it as, how do you want your community to change, not will your community change? Because people really get hung up on the idea that somehow or other by preventing change to the built environment, they can prevent change in the community. And by preventing change in the built environment, they're actually facilitating other kinds of change more rapidly.
I mean, it's a subtle but really profound point. I mean, I think it's partly because, like, when a building gets demolished and rebuilt, right, it's this event, it's a discrete event, but your neighborhood gradually getting richer and less representative, and there's no longer children playing out on the street, right? those are subtle
Those are
changes.
subtle.
I mean, I was back home over the holidays, and it's been nice these last few years because Lexington has housing affordability challenges like every city, but there's basically something approaching housing abundance, or there's enough housing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're in a more conventional housing situation where they just probably need to spend more on income restricted housing and get more vouchers. But in the neighborhood that I grew up in, right, there was this cycle where my parents buy a home there when I'm a kid. Me and my sister are kids. Gets built out, lots of kids in the neighborhood. There was this period where there were no kids, and now it's back. The neighborhood cycled through, and a new generation of people with kids are in there, and it's just fun to be back because it tickles my parents to death because the community has, in a meaningful sense, stayed the same, right? Because it's kept its character of this place where young families move here when they need a little bit of extra housing space, right?
And that's the cycle that people expect and think will happen. That certainly was the case with me in Ventura, where we were on the leading edge of the neighborhood built in the 60s. We were on the leading edge of the second generation, right? But now, that house, which I bought in the 1980s for $100 and some odd thousand, is now well over $1 million, right? And so you can see the school population is in decline because people with kids can't afford there are no starter homes there anymore. That cycle is great when it works, but again, there's this mismatch between our expectation that housing will remain affordable and the expectation that housing will create wealth for us, right? And as a policy, we're trying to do both those things at the same time, and I don't think you can do both those things at the same time.
Well, I mean, a couple of things on that. I mean, first, with the 2020 census data, the thing that struck me most was how many suburbs in Metro LA and the Bay Area were actively losing population, right?
Yes.
And these aren't places that were undergoing any economic contraction. These were places where they had been places where young families cycled through over time, and maybe 1 or 2 units were built a decade in some of these neighborhoods. And basically just all of that stopped, right? And people got stuck in place, and these homes became unaffordable to young families. And now the population is falling. But I want to interrogate the tension between housing affordability and housing as wealth building a little bit. I mean, I think in a place like Houston, right, homes will homes and land will hold their value in real terms, right? I mean, it's not this thing that's going to lose you money, right? So I've mentioned this, I think, in previous discussions, but I was talking to a family member whose home had gone up by a certain amount of value. I looked it up; it had held its value in real terms, right? And that's good. Like that's probably basically fine. That's kind of, it was a good store of wealth. They can get.
No, there is right. So you are building wealth in the sense that your house is appreciating with the economy, and you are paying down your debt, right? Mm-hmm. But that does create wealth, but I think people expect to create wealth through home ownership by latching on to a rapidly escalating housing price.
Yeah, I mean, like a healthy housing market, your home will hold value, and it'll be this thing where you've built some equity. But if your home value is like 10xing, right? Like that's a red flag that something deeply dysfunctional has gone on, right? And I think on some level people are kind of aware of that. I mean, I think.
Yeah, but if you're a beneficiary of it, you're not going to want to see that, right? What I find talking to longtime homeowners in California who are sympathetic to the cause of housing abundance, I will find that when you say, my gosh, housing is so expensive, they'll sort of shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, it's a real problem, but not one that they take seriously because it does not affect them personally. And having a $2 million in home equity is a nice thing to have for basically doing nothing except living in your house for 20 years is a nice thing to have.
Right. Well, and then people don't draw the connection between, oh, my home 10x'd in value, and now there's a man living in a tent, under an overpass just down the block from my home, right?
Right.
I think these are seen as kind of like, oh, that's just a mental health or a substance abuse problem, and there's not a connection between, well,
or a problem created by not enough income restricted, very low income housing.
Right. Yeah.
As if that's separate from the regular housing market.
Yeah. I think most of my listeners are pretty familiar with your work, but for those who aren't, of course, you literally wrote the book on California planning. I keep it handy. Yeah, here it is. And refer to it almost on a daily basis. Oh, nope, it's not going to let me show it. Sorry, guys.
Because you're blurred in the back.
Yeah, hold on, let me try this. There we go.
There you go. That's much better.
It's the old one. Sorry. But so I want to throw you a question here, and don't worry about the listeners' feelings. I'm kind of wondering, what do you think YIMBYs are getting wrong, or what do you think YIMBYs could do better? I think that there's this while you think about that, I'll set up the question a little bit. I think there's this precociousness to YIMBY that was very healthy. A lot of young people showing up at public hearings and saying, no, actually, I support this additional housing, and the NIMBY is no longer the hero of the story. But I think there is a fair critique of certain elements of YIMBY where it's like crashing into housing policy discussions that have been going on for a while. It strikes me that looking back over the past, we're probably wrapping up the first decade of YIMBY politics, and strikes me there's a lot of big wins, a lot of false starts. You have this broader scope of California planning. I'm curious to get your perspective.
So what do I think YIMBYs are getting right, and what are YIMBYs getting wrong? I think you're right that the YIMBYs have successfully changed the conversation and introduced the idea in a way that wasn't introduced before, that more housing supply is desirable and necessary for California to be prosperous, and for California to work for people, especially for middle class people. Crashing into the housing conversations without really acknowledging that those have been going on for decades. Yeah, YIMBYs did that. But I think I would say two things: single-minded focus on increasing supply. I think the YIMBYs sometimes made a naive mistake of not trying to figure out how to collaborate with the low-income housing advocates and the poverty advocates. Right? They are tough to deal with. They have a different agenda. You can't. I know from experience, you can't say anything about spending public money on middle-income housing without incurring their wrath, right? Because all public money should go to low-income housing. Nevertheless, I think that partnership, which should have been there from the beginning, has been slow to develop. The other thing I think that YIMBYs could learn some lessons on is, well, I guess a couple of other things. One is this whole question of, does more housing supply, will that really create more affordability? And I think a lot of people say no. I know from talking to my friends in Ventura now that a lot of people that I would expect to be for more housing are against more housing, because who needs more $1 million condos downtown? So I think understanding better the circumstances that are necessary for additional housing supply to create more housing affordability is important. Filtering down works sometimes, in some cases, and not in other cases. And I think I'm giving you your research agenda, Nolan, I think, but I think that understanding when filtering works and when it doesn't work, and how to focus housing policy on those circumstances when it does work, so that increased housing supply will increase affordability, I think would be a good thing. Another thing I think is important, and this occurred to me when you and I, Nolan, were at the Seaside a few weeks ago, is that understanding the importance of urban design is really important. That is a way to mitigate NIMBY opposition, to show to be able to truly show, visually show, and with examples that that more dense development can be attractive, and sometimes even more attractive than what's already there. Because otherwise you get into this fight at the local level with the NIMBYs over if the developer wants 20 units an acre, then the NIMBYs want 15, even though they have no idea what 15 or 20 units an acre look like. I can remember many years ago, I had a conversation with Don Terner himself, the founder of Bridge Housing and the guy after whom the Terner Center is named. And Don used to do this really clever thing when he was trying to build an affordable housing project somewhere in the Bay Area. He would take the planning commission or whoever on a bus tour of different neighborhoods in the Bay Area, and he would play guess the density with them. And what he said was, almost without exception, the density that they guessed was a proxy for their opinion about the design of the project. If they liked the design of the project, they guessed the density was too low. And if they didn't like the design of the project or it was ugly, they would guess that the density was too high. So I think one thing we can learn from the new urbanists is it's not really always about the amount. It's also about the quality, and there can be more tolerance for amount if you get more quality. The other much more difficult politically thing that I think the YIMBYs and other housing advocates might do is try to understand and explain more the other brakes on housing mobility in California, right? Prop 13 is an enormous brake on housing mobility, right? Because it encourages people to stay in their house way longer than why would people get to a certain age and they don't want to move anyway. But why should it be, as my former in-laws did, why should you be 85 years old living in a 3,500 square foot house above Beverly Hills that is worth $3 million? I mean, there's no reason in the world you should do that. People get comfortable where they live, but if you can give them, but Prop 13 and other things like that are a brake on housing mobility. So I think it's not just about supply. I think what I'm trying to say is it's not just about supply. Supply is a necessary but not sufficient precondition. It's about true mobility and access. And there are a lot of different factors to that. Supply is one of them. And we suppressed supply for 35 years. We need more supply, but we also need to get the right people in the right houses, right? You've got a lot of older folks sitting on a lot of house. California treats capital gains as regular income, right? Is that a brake on housing mobility? Because if you're sitting on $2 million in equity, are you reluctant to sell your house and take the tax hit? Is that a brake on housing mobility? I think those are the kinds of conversations that we don't usually have, that I think in the next phase, in sort of the adolescent phase of the YIMBY movement, now that your childhood is over, those are the kinds of things you might want to introduce in the conversation. So you got to make sure that the supply benefits the people you hope it to develop. And one of the biggest targets for the anti-YIMBY folks now is, so we're getting more supply, prices are going up, not down. And there's a lot of reasons for that aren't just about supply.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all great thoughts. And I mean, a couple things. One, yeah, I almost just want to stop talking about dwelling units per acre or FAR for that matter. Just give me setbacks and height, and what the building is, maybe even the building materials, right? Like I think exactly.
Right. Well, that's a form-based code.
Right, the basic new urbanist insight that people kind of only really care about how a building relates to the road. But I fully buy into that, and I almost I joke, like if you could just say like a mandate that everything be clad in brick would get us like 10% more housing. Sure, why not? Go for it. A gable on everything, no matter how absurd it looks, go for it. Yes, people like postmodern and they think it's traditional design. Great. I mean, I think you're getting into the tax implications of growth policy. I mean, I think another issue that is a little bit of a blind spot for us right now is the local public finance, right? The incentive structure facing local governments. And of course, we talk a lot about Prop 13. I mean, if you want to get Yimbys riled up at a happy hour, just talk about Prop 13. I look out across, I was looking at this map of states, a heat map of states based on the average property tax bill. And it's like New Jersey, Illinois, New Hampshire, and Texas. And it's like, well, these states have nothing in common, but they do all kind of build a lot of housing, right? And I assume that that's related to the fact that the local government public finance incentives are all there, right? They're going to get like property tax bills from these new developments. A little bit of a contrarian case here. I think there's a lot of push right now to limit impact fees in California. And on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to that. I mean, it's clearly a lot of jurisdictions just use these for revenue generation off the backs of, people coming into the community. On the other hand, I see that, impact fees are this way to work around Prop 13, not letting jurisdictions collect property taxes. And I worry that if you take away their ability to do that, it's not going to mean you get all the same amount of housing, but without having to pay this big impact fee. I think it'll just take away the incentive of local jurisdictions to permit a lot of this housing.
If they can't collect the impact fees.
Strong view, lightly held. But yeah.
What I would say is that if you look at California from purely a tax perspective, obviously the state's policy is to encourage local governments to allow a lot of retail and not very much housing, right? Mm-hmm. That is what the tax structure is set up to incentivize local governments to do. And maybe you need to find a way to turn that around and turn that on its head.
And that's why we have auto dealerships next to the Expo line in Culver City, right? Because the sales tax are great. You want a multifamily building would be crazy. Like keep it auto dealerships, right?
As long as the auto dealerships are really viable, right? As an aside, one of the things that I've found interesting in the world of infill development along transit lines is how auto dealers who own great pieces of land have become enthusiastic infill developers. I've seen that in a number of cases because they happen to have this huge piece of land next to a transit station.
Car dealership redemption arc, right?
Right. There's one of those in West LA. You would have to restructure the entire tax system in order to do that, because Prop 13 basically limits the amount of property taxes and then the legislature divvies it up. In order to give more property taxes to cities, especially to incentivize them, because cities don't get very much of the property tax, typically about 15%. In order to give more property tax incentive to cities to build housing, you'd have to take some of that property tax revenue away from schools, and then the state would have to somehow backfill that from other revenues, maybe sales tax, that is always the state has the opposite incentive as well. The state has the incentive to push as much property tax as possible to the schools, because if the schools aren't funded by property tax, then the state's going to have to foot the bill. So not only do cities have a perverse incentive to not allow housing and allow retail instead, the state has a perverse incentive to choke cities from getting more property tax under Prop 13.
Right. Yeah. So many thoughts on this. I'm gonna maybe change gears a little bit on this. I if we talk about local public finance for too long, people will start dropping off. We'll talk about it after the call a little bit more. Let's talk about RHNA, because this is, I think, it's related in the sense where I think that there's an issue of local government incentives. I mean, so I'm going to throw out some thoughts here, and I want to see what you think. It strikes me that part of what's gone wrong with land use planning in the U.S. is that housing markets are metropolitan, right? When I'm deciding where to live, I don't stop and start at the borders of Santa Monica or L.A. or Culver City. I look everywhere, right? Same with labor markets, right? When I'm looking for a job, I'm looking in this whole anywhere within an hour commute catchment area. depending on what my mode of transportation is. But then we do land use planning, which determines how many jobs or how many housing units can be anywhere on a purely local basis, right? So within Metro LA, it's like 88 jurisdictions within this effectively one housing and labor market, right?
Yes, yes, pretty much.
We try to solve that. So there's no coordination, of course, and everybody has this weird incentive to get as many jobs and as few housing units as possible. So we're in this giant prisoner's dilemma where, nobody cooperates. And so then we try to backfill this by saying, we're going to do the regional housing needs assessment where we say every jurisdiction, we want you to come up with a plan for housing. You need to permit your fair share of housing. But we haven't changed the disincentives to allow new housing. And I tend to actually be a little bit more optimistic about RHNA than a lot of YIMBYs. I think the modal housing element, I think, is actually good and will facilitate some housing that wouldn't have been built otherwise. But I do worry about the limits of a system where we're saying to local governments, you have to do this thing. We know you don't want to do it. You get to come up with a plan for how to do it, and you get to implement it. And if you're Huntington Beach and you're a convenient political enemy, we might come and mess with you. But otherwise, we want you to go through the motions and adopt this plan. And I think it still remains to be seen if a lot of the recent reforms are going to have teeth and change the way the systems work historically. But I worry that continuing to rely on the system where local governments have almost unlimited authority on land use planning, trying to tinker on the margins of that is maybe a futile project. I've stated that a little bit strongly because I want to see, I want to get your perspective on this.
Well, the state's solution to that is to restrict the permitting discretion of local governments, right? That's a much more. I'm just keep skipping over RHNA to that point. I don't think there's any question. Well, for the first 30 or 40 years, the RHNA process didn't do much, right? Nobody took it seriously. Nobody felt that there was much of a penalty for not following it, right? You don't want affordable housing. You don't have a compliant housing element. What's your penalty? You don't get your affordable housing money to build the affordable housing that you don't want to build in the first place, right? That was what happened for the first 40 years. I do think that a lot of the cities believe, Huntington Beach aside, Huntington Beach has been very aggressive, but in reacting. But I think a lot of the cities are thinking, oh, we can wait out the Newsom administration, right? In a couple of years, there'll be a budget crisis in the state. The Housing Accountability Unit will get shut down. The AG will stop going after the cities, and this won't be a big deal, right? What's the penalty? I think the biggest. That's why I think what's most important about the increased RHNA numbers is, and Senator Wiener's been very clever about this, is, to make non-compliant cities more vulnerable to getting hit with SB 35 or other ministerial stuff. I think that's the game that Wiener's playing, right? It's not about getting the cities to build more housing as a result of the RHNA. It's about putting RHNA out of reach so that they can't meet it, so that then the state can say, oh, you haven't met it, so therefore you get a penalty, or therefore there's more ministerial. I think that's where that's going. I go back to our previous conversation at the risk of turning off listeners who don't want to hear about tax policy, and say, if you really want to make this work, you got to revamp the whole tax policy of the state so that the local governments have the right fiscal incentives to do what they want to do. One of the things that the cities, I'm sure the league is saying about impact fees is you shut down property taxes. So we went to impact fees. Now you want to shut down impact fees. What are we supposed to do, right? How do we pay for anything? Which is not an unfair point, right? Because you can't get it out of the property tax anymore. If you can't get it out of the impact fees, then what do you do? So in my ideal world, I think you restructure the tax policy as well in order to provide the right incentives accompanying the RHNA. But obviously the ideal world isn't going to occur. I do think that one of the things that you could do, this was easier when redevelopment was around, is allow transfer of RHNA obligations from jurisdictions to jurisdictions essentially for a price.
Well,
I used to propose this. People would say, but it's immoral for Beverly Hills to not build any housing. And I'd say, well, yeah, but at least Beverly Hills would have to buy their way out of the situation rather than just getting out for free.
First, I'll flatter you a little bit. I couldn't remember when redevelopment agencies got abolished, and I was about to reach for my guide to California planning.
2012, 11 years ago.
So when I came out to California now about 3 years ago, redevelopment agencies were kind of a historical curiosity. Right. What's the 60-second? I mean, I hear about redevelopment agencies somewhat regularly. For folks who are new and they're probably still hearing about this, what did redevelopment agencies do and why were they abolished?
Redevelopment agencies, that was California's tax increment system. So cities could finance infrastructure and other things through tax increment by declaring blight and creating a redevelopment zone, by which they would get a portion of the increased property tax revenue in the future. One of the reasons why the league and cities often say, well, you took away our most important affordable housing funding tool is that some percentage of tax increment had to be spent on affordable housing and could be spent anywhere in the jurisdiction, not just in the zone. The flaw was, this is a deep dive into California tax policy, and I'm sorry about this. One of the reasons why redevelopment became so attractive to cities was that they could unilaterally grab property tax revenue, not only from themselves, but from the other taxing entities. By creating a redevelopment zone, they got all of the tax increment, including the tax increment that went to the school, the tax increment that went to the county. By the time Jerry Brown became governor, 12% of the property taxes in the entire state were going to redevelopment agencies. Because of other school equalization laws, the state had to make up that difference. So the state had to backfill the schools when they lost property taxes to the cities under redevelopment. And Brown eliminated redevelopment, and he did it in a very clever way, which I won't go into. He eliminated redevelopment basically as a budget balancing measure for the state, so that the state did not have to backfill and bail out the school districts anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and I mean, that's why some of the affordable housing community quite like these things. So they were a way for local governments to claw back some of the money that was going to be sent to counties or schools, but it was on, it had conditions such that they had to spend a certain portion of this on affordable housing.
Right. So, and it's fair to say that redevelopment was the largest affordable housing finance program in the state, and not most of it was not spent on affordable housing. But cities and the league in particular have often used that as saying, oh, the state is unfair to us because the state took away our, now you expect us to build affordable housing, but you took away our main financing tool to do it, which is exaggerated, but not entirely untrue.
Yeah, I mean, I think a related point to this, of course, some jurisdictions make this claim in bad faith, but I think also equally common, completely valid, where there's these large below market, mandates being placed by RHNA and not necessarily funding lined up to right. have the subsidies there. Now, of course, when you're hearing this in a place like Beverly Hills, where they could allow one market rate and get 4 affordable units, right? I mean, this is a little absurd, but in some, less red hot housing markets, I think there's something to that, right? There does need to be more money kicked into
yes, make those projects work. Yeah, and I was having a conversation earlier today about affordable housing projects and mixed income projects in different parts of the country, and the person I was talking to who's in the Midwest was saying, yes, you can make those mixed income projects work on the coasts because you can use the market rate portion of the mixed income project to subsidize the affordable. In a lower cost market like where he was in Minnesota, that's not possible. So, but if if you put all the burden on developers to do that, then they'll complain that they're being unfairly targeted. And why are they the ones who have to solve the housing problem, the affordable housing problem, which is a societal problem?
Right. Well, and I think that developers aren't even making the strongest case, right? I mean, I think they could say this cost just gets passed on to future home buyers, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah, I mean, here's a heuristic for IZ. When I'm looking at an IZ program that doesn't have a subsidy, if it's a nice clean number, that worries me, right? Like if it's 25% of units at 80% AMI, to me, that's like, I read that and I'm like, that doesn't feel like it came out of a rigorous study,
No,
right? That
probably
reads like politics to me.
Right, and it's not, and it is also true that in some cases, anti-housing cities will set that number really high, knowing that that will discourage anybody from building anything, because you can't, if it's 40 or 50% without a subsidy, you can't make that pencil. So no projects will get built, which is what the city wants.
Right. Yeah, well, and I guess the flip side is you look at like Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities program, and if you look at the unit percentages, it's like 8. I think it's like tier 1 is like 8, 11, and 21%, and you're like, good, that number was not political. That was, a bean counter figuring out exactly what would pencil, and of course that's one of the more successful programs.
Yeah, it is.
I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about Houston, but I want to do a very short lightning round. A couple quick questions for you, if that's okay.
All right. Sure.
All right. Most underrated city in California. Let's set aside Ventura for the sake of conversation.
Sacramento.
Why is that?
Sacramento is a really good urban city. The core of it is really, really good. It's far better. Sacramento has a reputation as a cow town, but it is, and it's becoming more urbane all the time. It obviously has gone up in price a lot with a lot of Bay Area refugees, but I think it's a very livable city, and one that, partly because it's inland, doesn't get a lot of credit for being a really good city to live in.
I mean, I love Sacramento. I mean, I'm a policy person, and so are you, right? So everybody needs to take that with a grain of salt. Right. It's like fun to be around a bunch of other policy people and bureaucrats.
But that's not the only reason I like it.
No, totally. I mean, it's an amazing street grid. I think it's probably the most walkable and bikeable city in California, which would really upset some people, but I'd stand by that. It's got a huge, big street grid.
And it's flat, and partly because it's flat.
Yep. It's flat. There's a lot of active storefronts, a lot of corner bars and groceries. You're pretty close to the Sierra Nevadas and Tahoe.
Yep.
If you work 2 or 3 days out of the week in the Bay Area, it's not an unreasonable commute. I really love Sacramento. I was telling somebody the other day, I was like, if I was going to go out bar hopping in a California city, I think I might actually go to Sacramento.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes.
Because I mean, LA of course has like the world-class clubs, but then you're doing the absurd like swingers thing where like everybody gets in their car and drives, and then you spend an hour looking for parking, and then you drive to the next place, and you're
right. Whereas in downtown or midtown Sacramento, you can just walk down the street.
Yep, exactly. Love Sacramento. Best restaurant in Houston. We're gonna talk about Houston in a minute.
There's a lot of competition for best restaurant in Houston.
Let's say your favorite cheap eats. Let's say
favorite cheapies. Cheap eats. Oh my gosh, Torchy's Tacos for sure.
Yeah,
which is from Austin, I think, but best tacos in the world.
Better than Southern California. Wow, I mean,
much better. Tacos in Texas are really very good. I mean, Tex-Mex is from Texas, not from California, right?
Yeah. I love Tex-Mex. Girlfriend never wants to go get Tex-Mex, so we'll get Tex-Mex together sometime. But back to the wonkier policy here. King for a day, California. You got to change one policy affecting planning.
Prop 13.
You make it permanent, right?
Just get rid of the reassessment on sale. Get rid of the no reassessment on sale part of Prop 13.
Okay, I'm gonna throw you a softball devil's advocate. I'm sure you heard it a million times. Low income retiring senior going to get priced out of their home. Property tax bills going up year over year. It's unfair that they get priced out. Shouldn't people be able to stay in their home and not get priced out?
Then target it.
Hmm.
Over city, like in Texas, there's an over 65 exemption, which
Yeah.
so instead of a blanket blunt instrument, target it, and that will have much less of an effect. That will still protect the older seniors to some extent, but it will not screw up the whole system.
Destroy your entire system of government. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean, so there was a little bit of a property tax revolt in Lexington. We talked a lot about Auburn, so you got to give me Lexington.
Sure.
I always when I'm doing book events, I joke all of my examples in the book are from America's two great cities, New York City and Lexington, Kentucky. But there was a little bit of a tax revolt in Lexington, and it was purely like suburbanites misappropriating legitimate property tax concerns in a gentrifying neighborhood to say, hey, look, these people are getting priced out of their home. Let's have a fixed rate, annual property tax increase. And the city, I think, did the right thing. They were, if you're a long-term homeowner below a certain income, above a certain age, we'll give you property tax relief. You back pay it when you sell the home, right? Easy, right? Like to my mind, I'm very sympathetic to that senior, right? The low income.
And the problem with Prop 13 is that it's a blunt instrument, and it was deliberately designed as a blunt instrument because the homeowners were not the major beneficiaries. Don't ever forget who Howard Jarvis worked for. He worked for the apartment association. He worked for the apartment owners. They were the real beneficiaries of Prop 13. So, which is why it's not targeted.
Right. Well, and then of course there was discussion. I think it was Prop 15 to remove Prop 13 exemptions for commercial property, and it was being branded as like, well, they were calling it like the Disneyland tax or something.
Yeah, split roll. Another possibility of reforming Prop 13 would be to do split roll. Yes, and among other things that might motivate long time. I think one of the problems that we've seen, although a break on infill development, has been long time. Your family has owned this commercial property for 50 years. You got no mortgage on it. You have pre-Prop 13 taxes. So you have no motivation to develop it. You've got some sort of revenue producer sitting on it, and you're fine. As I would say, when somebody's in the business of cashing checks, it's really hard to suggest to them that they should be in a different business, even if they could make more money.
Yeah, I mean, so in New York, we would call the little one-story commercial buildings, we literally called them taxpayers. So the idea was that
they just pay the tax.
Some parent or grandparent had paid the mortgage off. They had a stable tenant, probably a tenant paying well below market rate even, and they pay their property tax every year and collect a big fat paycheck, right? I mean, this is what was exciting me about Prop 15, because I mean, if AB 2011 passed, that was the bill that allows, as you know, but for the listeners, that was the bill that allows mixed income multifamily on commercial corridors. If you had AB 2011 pass, and it did pass, but along with Prop 15, then you would have had a wave of second, third generation strip mall owners say, oh, this strip mall that's like permanently half empty in West LA makes no sense. I'm going to sell this and have it be mixed income multifamily.
And I think what you just identified was a useful marrying of land use policy and tax policy, which California has not done in ever.
So let's talk about California's arch rival a little bit. You've been in Houston, thinking a lot about Houston lately. Texas is the arch rival, excuse me, not Houston. I find Californians, well, they either like Houston or they hate Houston. There seems to be no in between. Houston is endlessly fascinating to me. Of course, only major American city that doesn't have zoning. Lots of things that are kind of sort of like zoning. Yeah, I mean, what attracted you to Houston?
I was offered a great job at Rice, which I had for 8 years. I don't think I would have come to Houston or Texas otherwise. I was offered the opportunity to take a small research urban think tank and build it up into a big deal, the major urban think tank for Houston. And I sort of had the sense, I had not spent much time in Houston, but I sort of understood that intuitively that Houston's time was coming as a city, which it did. during my time there, not because I was there. But Houston is taken much more seriously as a major American city now than it was when I arrived at Rice in 2014. The other thing I would say is that as the advisability of single-family zoning has been questioned in the last, say, 2 years, and the racist underpinnings of zoning have become more prominent. The way Houston does land use has become more interesting to people around the country, and they want to know more about it, and they want to understand what the pros and cons are. And that's something I never would have expected, and I think it's really interesting. And the planners here are also very interesting in the way that they start with a much more practical, market-oriented, less idealistic starting point about what the development of their city is going to be.
How do you mean by that? Unpack that for me.
Well, you can't just pretend that every building's going to be a mixed-use building. You can't just pretend that what you want to go where is going to go where. You can't pretend that a project you can't zone in something that isn't going to be built and that nobody wants to build, and zone out something everybody wants to build, which I think happens a lot in California, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so the planners have to start with them, okay, how do you incentivize the right thing to happen? The thing about no zoning in Houston and Houston's general approach is that things happen really fast. Good things happen really fast. Bad things happen really fast. So which is why Houston is such a mixed quality. It has great neighborhoods like LA. Or Philadelphia. Houston is a city of great neighborhoods. It doesn't hang together, right? Because there's really never been any comprehensive planning for the city. So I think you have to start with, okay, what will the market bear? What are developers willing to build? And then how do you try to make sure that stuff gets built in a place that's beneficial to the community as well as to the developer, which obviously doesn't always happen.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I talk a lot about Houston in my book, and, to my mind, I always try to be careful to stress that I think Houston helps us to understand the possibilities and the limits of kind of non-zoning, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right.
Right. So every now and then I'll say something positive about Houston, and then somebody will they'll convulse, right? And they're like, how could you say anything positive about Houston? It's the worst place I've ever been. And, it's this sprawling mess. And I'm like, yeah, but, a lot of what's unpleasant about Houston isn't that different from what's unpleasant about Atlanta or Dallas or a whole bunch of other peer cities that came up. That I always try to stress this. I mean, I think Houston came up in a very different time in terms of mobility technology than a place like Boston or Philadelphia, right? Houston was, no matter what the land use regulations were, Houston was never going to look like, Copenhagen, right? Period.
Yeah, and I don't think actually a friend of mine at Rice wrote a book about Houston and Copenhagen, but I don't think Houston looks that different than Dallas, for example. And I always say among large American cities, Houston is probably more like LA than any other large American city. Huge grid, multiple jobs, big, dense job centers, great neighborhoods scattered in odd places, things like that. So I don't think, like I say, you do see the weird land uses next to each other. I have a slide of a single family home in the front, and then right behind it is a roller coaster. And I have to explain that not everybody in Houston has a roller coaster in their backyard. But I do think that, but I think it's really interesting that in this time when zoning is questioned, Houston has become a subject of interest on the part of a lot of planners and thinkers about urban planning. Houston does not have zoning for use. It doesn't have a lot of height restrictions. It does have a lot of other stuff the development code has, parking requirements and things like that. And so what there's one guy in town who says that what Houston really has is a really bad form-based code.
Yeah, I actually really like that. Yeah, because there's still the large front setbacks along a lot of streets.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
Yes,
I
that's
think
right.
that I think with the way I think of what's sort of gone wrong with American planning is that we absolutely micromanage the private realm, right? So if you want to build anything, like the minor details of that are going to be regulated down to, inches of
Right.
setback and
Right.
facade materials. Then the public realm, we kind of just let it go, completely hand it over to cars, very negligent management. I mean, I think this is especially acute in a place like LA, right? I mean, just
Yes. Yes,
you
which is the exact opposite of pre-zoning planning. So,
right.
if you think back to, say, the Daniel Burnham plan for Chicago, the
Mm-hmm.
1908 plan, it had nothing to do with private development at all. It was
Mm-hmm.
all about the public realm, how to maximize the value and the beauty of the public realm in order to set the table for private development,
Right.
and then let private development do what it wanted to do. Another interesting thing about Houston is, although the streets are given over to cars, Houston does have one of the great park systems in the country,
Mm-hmm.
and and is in the process of building out 120 miles of greenways along the bayous, and will end up with, not one of the great public realms in the country. It's just not on the streets. It'll be along the bayous and in the parks.
Right, right. Well, and I increasingly when I'm judging city, I mean, I think people have cities that they like and that they hate. Increasingly, I'm more interested in like what cities do I think are getting better or worse, right?
And Houston's definitely getting better.
Yeah, and so I see a city like Houston making significant investments in multimodal transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some of the livable communities reforms to things like parking mandates and stuff are extremely positive and more ambitious than what most cities are doing. And I say, yeah, I mean, they're coming from a very low baseline, right? I mean, the city was relentlessly planned around the car and just extreme divestment in the downtown and areas like that until quite recently. But I see improvement, right? And something that, I'll say provocatively, I think the flip side is a place like New York, where New York is operating from this fantastic baseline. I mean, it's America's city.
But it's not getting better.
It's marvelous, but then there's none of the like fundamental changes that need to happen with subway management or transit or trash collection seem to be happening, right? It seems to be stuck in this at the same problems that it's had for decades, right? I mean, other than solving crime in the 90s, right?
And again, that's partly because of what we talked about before about LA, which is that the thicket of interest is so dense that it's really hard to get anything done. And one of the things about Houston, interesting thing about Houston is, for better or worse, the thicket of interest is not that great. The government is not as powerful as it is elsewhere. The philanthropic and civic sector is really strong and often funds these public goods, for better or worse. And so it's not that hard to get things done. It may not be the most representative city. It certainly comes down at the bottom of every list for inclusiveness. But it is a place where you can throw a lot of money at a problem and get something done. Not usually through the government, but often through the philanthropic sector. The philanthropic sector has funded most of this Bayou Greenway stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple more positive things. My favorite, one of my favorite buildings, Michael Graves, the Federal Reserve branch.
Yes, right. I used to live right down the street from that.
Love it. I always like to throw out that probably the most successful missing middle reform of the past 25 years was probably townhouse legalization.
Yeah,
in Houston.
I think that's probably right.
I mean, I know the new urbanists they don't love the front loading garages. I don't love them either. But that's a massive amount of infill, and a town, that's a missing middle typology. And it was built like 20, 30,000, 40,000 units.
I lived in one of those for a long time, in one of those early 2000 townhomes.
How'd you like it?
Yeah. I got tired of the stairs. The interior, this is where the public realm becomes important because
Mm.
you don't really have very much private space. There was an old joke that some mayor of Houston long ago said Houstonians don't need parks. He didn't want to invest in parks. He said Houston doesn't have parks. Everybody's got a backyard, so we don't need it. Well, that's not true anymore, right? So I think the public with townhome living, having lived in a Houston townhome for a long time, I think the public realm becomes more important because that's your escape. This was especially true during COVID. We lived near the Michael Graves Fed, which is right next to Buffalo Bayou. And during COVID, Buffalo Bayou was the relief valve for the whole city, for particularly for those who lived in townhomes and didn't have really any outdoor space.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So yeah, I mean, so that would suggest like over the long term, as more Houstonians, we were in Seaside, right? You mentioned previously, and Andres Duane was raising this about what they figured out with some of these developments was, small homes on small lots. That's actually how you kind of pull people out into these public spaces, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, you feel that very robustly.
Don't give them a backyard.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing about how do you get people out of their cars.
Mm-hmm.
You just make driving inconvenient, right? You just you make the alternative more painful than just walking or riding a bike. And you feel that very. I mean, Edward Glazer has this line, right? Like when you live in New York, like the park is your backyard, right. The coffee shop is your your study, right. The bar is your sort of family room, right? Like you substitute these third places and public spaces for spaces that are private, and
right. And that's what we're seeing as infill development. It goes back to the point I made in Place and Prosperity, where I said my town is my house.
Right.
That to me, it's unsatisfying to have to be totally dependent and focused on your house. That for life to be fulfilling and satisfying, I think you do have to have those third places that perform those functions for you.
And I love that, and I absolutely feel that. I wonder, the potential tension there, right? So like I was talking about this with Emily Hamilton, right? And she sort of said like what like how do we explain NIMBYism? And I think a view that she's articulated is that people view their neighborhood as their extended home. And how would you feel if somebody who you didn't know came into your living room and started shuffling around your furniture, or like chucking out your couch and replacing your couch, right?
And that is how that's a good point. That is how people feel about that.
But I think this is, well, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think there's a pro and a pro and a con to my town as my house, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But this is what this is a tension that I try to work through, is balancing out like having a deep sense of affection for a place and loving even individual buildings, right? One of my favorite buildings growing up was this very bizarre 70s experimental commercial building that was objectively like rounding out its lifetime, right? It needed to be redeveloped. It got built into something much uglier. On the one hand, that's sad to me. On the other hand, I think, hey, this is a part of a normal community changing and adapting over time. But I feel like we don't really sort of center that mindset, right? I think that so often people who I feel like even dare to care about their neighborhood end up falling into this mindset of we need to protect this thing, we need to keep it the way it is,
because it's so precious,
right? And it's I think it's a very it's sad because on the one hand, preservation, I'm not painting with too broad of a brushstroke of preservationism absolutely has an important role to play, but there is a certain type of preservationist who falls in love with the neighborhood and then believes that that love should be realized by never letting this place change, right? Freezing it in amber.
Goes back to the point we were making before about how people get so emotional about the physical aspect of the built environment of their neighborhood, even as they overlook all other change.
Right. Well, it's almost like saying like, you really love your kid, so I'm never going to let my kid move out, right?
Right.
Like I want them to stay with me forever.
Yep, that's right.
I don't know how you break past that view, though. I maybe just articulate.
You go back to what I think you go back to what I said before, which is you do your best to make the argument that the question is not whether to change or not. The question is what change do you want?
Yeah.
Do you really want demographic monotony.
Hmm.
You want to make the place unaffordable to people like you, um, in order to protect the built environment as it currently exists. Is that a trade-off you're willing to make? Is that a trade-off you really want to make? Because no one like you will ever live in this neighborhood again, even though the neighborhood will be preserved in the physical character that you like.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's the best. I think that's the best you can do. And even that doesn't work a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. You joke in the book that you can make any movie about cities.
About urban planning, right? Because movies are all about location.
Okay,
They're all
so
about location.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
try out a
okay.
couple on you.
All
We'll
right.
start with a softball here. Top Gun.
Well, isn't Top Gun really all about Ridgecrest or wherever it was filmed?
It's a San Diego film, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, originally yes, but Top Gun Maverick was filmed in Ridgecrest.
Oh, I was talking about the original one. I still
The
haven't seen the
original
new
one,
one.
yeah. No, I haven't seen the original one in so long that I'm not sure I remember.
I was gonna watch the new one. I was on a flight, and then I figured it would be disrespectful to Top Gun Maverick to watch it on a little airplane screen. So I.
Well, my high
uh,
school friend the location manager, would appreciate that.
I'll do a couple contemporary ones, and if you haven't seen it, you can just pass. Banshees of Inisherin.
I have not seen that one.
Oh, it's good. I actually have I have an urbanist feeling on it. It's about the poverty of small town life, and the beauty of cities is that you got to pick your friends. But
Yeah,
I'm not going to
okay.
say more. Spoil it for you.
I haven't been to the movies in a long time, so I may disappoint you this whole time. But go ahead.
Okay, we'll go back. We'll get to some easy ones here. Star Wars.
Well, Star Wars is all about place in different places, right? And the Death Star um is really sort of Robert Moses like, isn't it? Um,
Yeah, I think that's what Lucas says in the commentary. Actually, he read Power Broker.
he read Power Broker.
Okay. Shoot. I'm digging for classics here. Oh, here's another one. Like LA movie, Big Lebowski.
The Big The Big Lebowski is so rooted in place, right? I mean, you could not make the Big Lebowski about any place other than LA, and particularly LA at that time. I mean, so you live in Echo Park or Silver Lake or somewhere, and you couldn't replicate that. I mean, today he'd be 80 years old, it's a classic LA movie in the sense that, they so much of it takes place like in the grocery store and in the bowling alley, and they drive around, and I mean, it's a classic LA movie.
I think literally in the opening monologue, there's this meditation on LA in the 90s, and they're
And
like,
the
it was
and
this
the
liminal time and place.
and the Coen brothers are just drenched in place.
Oh yeah.
Any Coen brothers movie is just dripping with place, and of course it's very stylized and not very natural, because that's their approach. But just about any Coen brothers movie is just totally dripping in place.
Well, I mean, you can't go to a wedding or a funeral in the South without hearing about half of the "Oh Brother Where Art Thou" soundtrack. I mean, honestly,
Yes, and the Oh Brother We're Out There is really about the TVA, right? And it's about the
the South in a state of transition.
transition from the old rural South to the New Deal South, right?
Right. Yeah, fantastic movie. I mean, Barton Fink. That's another. It's just a classic LA movie,
I
right?
haven't I haven't seen Barton Fink in a long time, but yes, I used to use Barton Fink in my land use planning classes all the time as a descriptor. Yep.
The Life of the Mind. Um, I mean, another great place-based movie. I watched this recently, actually, for the first time. American Graffiti. Another good California movie.
It's a Modesto. It's
Right.
again, that's a Modesto movie, right? That's
Yeah.
about George Lucas growing up in Modesto, particularly the cruising scenes. It is totally dripping in time and place. And I can remember, I'm old enough to have watched American Graffiti when it came out in 1973,
Mm.
and it's set in 1963, and I can tell you that the cultural changes that occurred in the 60s, that movie in 1973 felt like it was set 50 years before.
Huh.
That's how big the differences were between the 60s and the 70s.
Well, and spoiler alert, if you haven't seen American Graffiti, it's a very good movie. You should skip ahead 30 seconds. Okay. The final scene, I mean, just smacks you over the head. Where like, yeah, half of these kids died in Vietnam. And you're like, what is that? Like, what is absolutely brutal close to this like very lighthearted movie?
Yep. Right. Well, that was what that time was like. So
right. Do you have a favorite? A couple more movie questions, then we'll wrap up here. Do you have a favorite fictional city?
Ooh, that's a good. Yes, I have a favorite fictional city. My favorite fictional city is Scott Turow's Kendall County.
I don't know about that. What's the story?
Scott Turow wrote Presumed Innocent. That was his most famous book. He writes legal thrillers. He's sort of a higher class John Grisham. But he lives in Chicago. But in the process of writing so he's a lawyer. He used to be a prosecutor. He writes legal thrillers. They're all set in this one Midwestern city, which is a little like Chicago, but not exactly. And he has really fleshed it out as a place, and as particularly a place and a location that has a lively political scene. People always say Presumed Innocent. That was a Harrison Ford movie later on. Was a great legal thriller, which it was, but that it was also a great book on urban politics. The machinations that go on, the different ethnic neighborhoods like you might find in Chicago. There's one book in which there's a black judge and how he approaches the prosecutors and the defense attorneys who grew up in the white ethnic parts of town plays a very important role. Yeah, I just love the way he created that fictional city, which is, as I say, based on and not unlike Chicago, but it's not exactly Chicago.
Yeah, I love it when a fictional city can just take a real city and then turn some of its qualities up to 11 and let you just explore. Yeah, a place.
That's what it does.
I was going to say best Los Angeles movie, but I'll open it up since you've worked all across the region. Best Southern California movie.
The best Southern California movie. I'm sorry, I'm an urban planner. I always come back to Chinatown.
It's great, isn't it?
Chinatown is the best LA movie. It's the best urban planning movie. I don't see a Southern California movie. That is LA movie making at its absolute best, I think.
Yeah. It's just Chinatown, right? I mean, just the disillusionment of a civil servant or of a detective, right, over time.
Right.
Remarkable movie.
Yep.
And I don't know if you play video games, but there was LA Noire riffed on a lot of these themes as well. It strikes me that this is a thing I've been trying to work through here. A lot of LA media seems uniquely conspiratorial. Like honestly, like Chinatown is about a conspiracy, right?
Right. Yes.
LA Noire is about a conspiracy. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, right? Like this is like this like folk history of Los Angeles transit. Well, it's a conspiracy. It's a very conspiratorial place, huh?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yes, probably right.
We'll collaborate on something here. There's something going on. Angelino's just distrust the local growth machine. I don't know, because it seems like this discourse started before. It
comes up again and again. Yeah, comes up again and again. Yeah.
Last couple minutes here. So what's next? You've just come out with Place and Prosperity. What are you working on now? What's coming around the pike here?
I really want to write a book about. I want to write a book called The Future of Where, which is all about the role that place will play in the post-COVID future. I haven't worked that out yet, what that looks like. I actually had a book proposal called The Future of Where, which I finished right in February of 2020, which was the wrong time to do it because everything's been turned upside down. What role does place play? What do cities have to have? Can downtown survive? One of the things I found is that the role of place is extremely enduring, although what people want or get out of a place changes over time, right? So there'll be downtowns in the future. They'll just be different, just as they're different now than they were in the past. They'll be different in the future. They'll be, somebody called them productive resorts. Downtowns are going to become productive resorts. I'm fascinated as well in thinking about the future of where in the future of place, who the place winners and losers are. A lot of the Zoom towns in the Rocky Mountain, in the Intermountain West are real winners. I live in Texas. All of the population and economic growth in Texas is occurring in the Texas Triangle. Half of the state could be Mississippi, right? And so what happens to those losers? And is there a way for them to use their place to claw their way back? I don't know. That's the next book I'd like to write. But COVID really turned it upside down, so I'm trying to figure it out.
Small question. Yeah, easy question, right? What do
we easy question.
Well, I've found so much of your work enriching, so I can't wait to hear what your answer is on that. New book, Place and Prosperity. It's fantastic. Certainly folks who have been following your work so far will not be disappointed. Thanks for joining Abundance, Bill. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Nolan.